Philadelphia, March the 17th, 1970. Morning. The funeral had ended 12 hours ago, but Marvin was still there, still standing in the wet grass of Woodlawn Cemetery, still wearing the same black suit that carried yesterday's grief like a second skin. The undertakers had finished their work before dawn. The flowers had been arranged across the fresh earth, white roses from the record label, mixed arrangements from family, simple daisies from fans. But Marvin remained motionless as the headstones around him. He wasn't supposed to be there. Everyone else had gone home to their lives, their grief that could be processed in private with living people who could offer comfort. Marvin had none of these things anymore. He had only the crushing weight in his chest and the conversation he'd been rehearsing for 3 years. The March morning was cold. His breath came in small white clouds that dissipated quickly, like words spoken to someone who couldn't hear them. The cemetery was empty, except for a groundskeeper in the distance. Marvin's shoes had sunk into the wet earth. He knelt down slowly, his hands reaching out to touch the soil that covered her. The earth was darker here, recently turned, different from the settled ground around older graves. "I'm sorry, Tammi." The words came out as a whisper, barely audible above the morning wind that rustled through bare tree branches. It was the first time he'd spoken since walking away from her casket the night before, when his voice had failed him during the final prayer. He stayed there until noon, when a groundskeeper gently suggested it was time to leave. Marvin looked up, nodded, and slowly rose to his feet. As he drove away, each step felt like leaving her again. But during that drive through Philadelphia streets, Marvin made a decision that would define the next 14 years of his life. He would return, every month, same day, until he found the words that could make this right. The first planned visit happened exactly 30 days later, on April 16th, 1970. Marvin told Anna he had studio business in Philadelphia, a lie that came easier than expected. He drove the 300 miles alone, his mind rehearsing what he would say. He brought white roses, 24 of them, because Tammi had once mentioned they reminded her of her mother's garden. He arranged them carefully around the temporary marker, treating the ritual like a performance he needed to get exactly right. "The studio feels different without you," he began, settling beside her grave. "Harvey keeps asking when I'll be ready to work with someone new, but how do you explain that your voice fit mine, like it was made for it?" He talked for 3 hours, covering everything from Motown politics to his marriage problems. His voice occasionally cracked, but he kept talking because silence felt like abandonment. "Anna thinks I'm having an affair," he told the headstone, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And maybe I am in a way. Maybe this is what it means to be unfaithful, talking to someone who can't answer back." When he returned to Detroit that evening, Anna noticed immediately. "You look different," she said, "calmer but sadder." "Just tired," Marvin replied, though it wasn't entirely a lie. May 16th came with another excuse to bury Gordy about visiting family. The lie felt heavier this time. He was beginning to understand that these trips weren't temporary therapy. They were becoming necessity. The May visit lasted 4 hours. He told Tammi about his growing paranoia, his nightmares that always featured the moment she collapsed in his arms. "I keep thinking I could have caught you differently," he said, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "Like if I'd been standing closer. The doctors say it wouldn't have mattered, but I can't stop replaying it." By summer, the monthly trips had developed a routine. Leave Detroit early morning, drive straight through, spend the afternoon at Tammy's grave, then drive back the same evening. 14 hours round trip, but he refused to stay overnight in Philadelphia. Something about sleeping in the same city where she was buried felt too permanent. The cemetery staff began to recognize him. George Williams, the head groundskeeper, noticed that Marvin was different from other mourners. Most people gradually reduced their visits, but Marvin's were becoming more intense. "He brings different flowers each time," Williams later recalled. "Always stays exactly 4 hours. Anna's questions became pointed. "You disappear every month on the same day, Marvin. Where are you going?" "It's personal business," he would reply, unable to meet her eyes. "Is it another woman?" The question stung because it was wrong and somehow accurate. There was another woman involved, but not in any way Anna could understand. By late 1970, Motown executives were concerned about Marvin's reliability. He would disappear without explanation, miss studio sessions, turned down lucrative duet opportunities. Berry Gordy called him in repeatedly. "You need to move forward professionally, Marvin," Gordy said during one heated exchange. "Tammi was talented, but you have a career to maintain. There are other female vocalists. Diana's available. Gladys is interested." Marvin sat through these lectures with practiced patience, nodding appropriately. But internally, he was composing his next conversation with Tammi, planning how he would describe Gordy's words to her. "Every time I step into a booth with someone new," he told Tammi during December, "I hear their voice and feel your absence like physical pain. With them, I'm just performing." As 1971 began, the monthly visits took on deeper significance. January 16th marked 10 months since Tammi's death. He began bringing letters he'd written, pages of thoughts he'd been accumulating. "I think I'm forgetting how to be happy," he read from one letter. "When we were recording together, there were moments when everything made sense. Now everything feels like work." After reading each letter, he would fold it carefully and bury it beside her grave, creating a private archive of grief that felt more real than most of his human connections. The February visit coincided with his birthday. He spent the entire day at the cemetery with cake and 2 forks. "31 years old today," he said, eating one piece while leaving another on her headstone. "You would have called this morning, probably sung to me in that silly voice you used to make me laugh." As winter turned to spring, Marvin's behavior at home became erratic. He would stare out windows for hours, lose track of conversations, forget appointments. Anna consulted their doctor. "He talks in his sleep," Anna told Dr. Henderson, "always to someone named Tammi." The March 16th anniversary visit in 1971 was the most intense yet. He brought a record player and sang both parts of their duets, his voice splitting between baritone and a higher register that approximated Tammy's range. "Ain't No Mountain High Enough sounds different on the radio now," he told her as the song played. "All I can think about is that night when you couldn't remember the words." By mid-1971, the cemetery visits were affecting every aspect of Marvin's life. He would schedule everything around his monthly trips to Philadelphia, automatically checking that nothing conflicted with the 16th. As 1972 to 1973 passed, Marvin's trips became more elaborate and ritualized. His marriage deteriorated, his Motown relationship grew contentious, his paranoia increased. The conversations at Tammy's grave became his primary outlet. "They want me to move to Los Angeles," he told her during one rain-soaked visit. "But I can't leave Detroit because then these trips would be harder." By 1973, his behavior had become precisely timed. 2 p.m. arrival, 6 p.m. departure. Same flower pattern, same sitting spot, regardless of weather. Motown had been pressuring him to work with other female vocalists, and he had finally agreed to a few sessions. But each collaboration felt like betrayal, like adultery committed against a memory that had become more real than his actual marriage. "I tried singing 'You're All I Need to Get By' with someone else yesterday," he confessed to Tammy's grave during a particularly emotional January 1973 visit, his voice breaking on the song title. "The words felt foreign in my mouth, like I was singing in a language I used to know but had forgotten." The producer said it sounded professional, but professional isn't what we were. We were something else entirely, something that can't be replicated or replaced or manufactured in a studio. The breakthrough moment came during the March 16th anniversary visit in 1974. 4 years of monthly trips, 48 consecutive visits, nearly 200 hours of one-sided conversation, thousands of words spoken to someone who couldn't respond. Marvin arrived with flowers and prepared words, as usual, but as he knelt beside Tammy's grave, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of what he was doing there. For the first time since her death, Marvin felt genuinely angry with her. "You left me," he said, his voice louder than it had ever been at the cemetery, loud enough that birds in nearby trees took flight. "I know you didn't choose to get sick. I know you fought as hard as you could, but you still left me here to figure this out alone. You left me to explain to people why I can't work with anyone else, why their voices sound wrong, why everything feels like a cheap imitation of what we had." The anger surprised him with its intensity and its clarity. For 4 years, he had been focused entirely on guilt, sadness, and longing. He had never allowed himself to feel abandoned, but that's exactly what he was. Abandoned to continue a career that had been built on collaboration with someone who was no longer available to collaborate. "I can't keep coming here," he continued, standing up for the first time during a cemetery visit, looking down at her name carved in granite. "I can't keep having conversations with someone who never responds. I can't keep loving a memory more than I love being alive." The permanence of the headstone hit him differently this time. She wasn't coming back. She would never respond to anything he said. These monthly visits weren't maintaining a relationship. They were prolonging his own emotional death, keeping him trapped in a moment that had ended 4 years ago. "I'm going to stop coming," he announced to the empty cemetery, his voice carrying over graves where other people's conversations had ended decades earlier. "Not because I don't love you, but because this isn't love anymore. This is me slowly disappearing into the same ground where you're buried." He walked away without leaving flowers for the first time in 4 years, each step feeling like resurrection and death simultaneously. For the first time since March 17, 1970, a month passed without Marvin making his pilgrimage to Philadelphia. But the absence of the ritual didn't bring the peace he had hoped for. Instead of concentrated monthly grief, Marvin now carried diffuse daily emptiness, like a low-grade fever that never broke, but never got bad enough to treat. The cemetery visits had been painful, but they had also provided structure, purpose, a reason to keep processing his emotions instead of simply numbing them. He threw himself into work with desperate intensity. Albums, touring, collaborations with artists he'd previously rejected, anything to fill the time and emotional space that cemetery visits had occupied. But the music felt mechanical, performed rather than felt. The connection between his heart and his voice had been severed along with his connection to Tammi. What's Going On had emerged from his grief, but even that masterpiece couldn't fill the void she'd left. Every song became an attempt to recapture something that was gone forever. Every studio session was a reminder that the voice that had completed his was silent. Years passed. Marvin aged, struggled with addiction, found and lost romantic relationships, battled demons that grew stronger as his ability to hope grew weaker. The drugs were partially an attempt to silence the conversations he continued having with Tammi in his head. Conversations that had moved from the cemetery into his daily life, becoming a constant internal dialogue with someone who never answered back. But every March 16th, regardless of where he was or what he was doing, he would stop and remember the decision he'd made at Tammi's grave 4 years earlier. The decision to stop visiting. Sometimes he questioned whether he'd made a mistake, wondered if returning to Philadelphia might restore some connection to the part of himself he'd buried there. But the finality of that last visit felt too important to undo, like a promise he'd made to himself about choosing life over death, present over past, possibility over memory. In 1983, during what would be one of his final interviews, a music journalist asked Marvin about Tammi. This time, he paused longer than usual before answering, as if deciding whether to tell a truth he'd kept hidden for nearly a decade. "I used to visit her grave," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every month for 4 years. I thought I was being faithful to her memory, keeping our connection alive. But I was really just being faithful to my own pain." On April 1st, 1984, the day before his death, Marvin's father found him sitting at the piano in their shared home on Gramercy Place, playing the opening chords to "Ain't No Mountain High Enough" over and over, his fingers moving automatically through the familiar progression, while his mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely. "What are you thinking about, son?" Marvin Sr. asked. Marvin looked up from the keyboard, his eyes distant and unfocused, as if he was seeing not his father but someone else, someone who existed only in memory. "Words I never got to say," he replied. "Conversations I never got to finish." 24 hours later, Marvin was dead, shot by the same man who had asked him what he was thinking about. The tragic irony wasn't lost on those who knew about the cemetery visits. Marvin had spent years talking to someone who couldn't respond. His final conversation was with someone who responded with violence. At Marvin's funeral service, several people suggested that he should be buried near Tammi. They were both originally from the East Coast. They had created their greatest work together. The symmetry seemed appropriate, even romantic. But Marvin's family chose a cemetery in Los Angeles. near where they lived rather than where his ghosts were buried. They wanted him close to the living, not close to the dead he had spent so much time visiting. Today, Tammi Terrell still lies in Woodlawn Cemetery in Philadelphia. Visitors occasionally leave flowers, mostly fans who remember the duets and want to pay their respects. The groundskeeping staff has changed over the years, and few current employees remember the man in the dark coat who came every month for 4 years in the 1970s. But George Williams, now retired, still remembers clearly. He'd talk for hours one hour, Williams recalls. I never got close enough to hear what he was saying, but I could tell it was important business. Some people need to keep talking until they find the right way to say goodbye. He never did find those words, I don't think, but he kept trying until it was killing him to try. The monthly visits had become legendary among certain Marvin Gaye fans, who would make their own pilgrimages to both cemeteries, Tammy's in Philadelphia and Marvin's in Los Angeles, trying to understand the connection that had defined both their music and their tragedy. Some fans claimed they could feel the weight of all those unfinished conversations, the emotional residue of a man who had loved so completely that it had become indistinguishable from grief. In the end, perhaps that was the real tragedy. Not just that Tammy died young, not just that Marvin couldn't save her, but that he had confused honoring her memory with prolonging his own suffering. The cemetery visits had become a form of emotional prison, keeping him trapped in the moment of loss rather than allowing him to carry her with him into whatever life remained. The words that stayed in the ground stayed there forever, but the voice that carried them, even in its eventual silence, never stopped trying to bridge the impossible distance between the living and the dead, between love and loss, between the man who kept talking and the woman who could no longer hear him.